here, not just for tonight's remarks and his leadership on this issue. It's just so great to have him in Congress. So thank you so much for your friendship and for your important leadership. Mr. Speaker, last month, President Trump correctly withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. And tonight, during this hour, several members of Congress were speaking here on the House floor regarding the administration's strategy to curb Iran's malign interests in the region and ensure Iran is no longer rewarded for its bad behavior. The Iran deal was fatally flawed for what was in it and fatally flawed for what was not in it. First, it is important to reflect on key lessons that should be learned from the manner in which the United States made several bad errors negotiating this so-called deal. We must learn these lessons to make sure that history never repeats itself. Well, first, the United States signed a preliminary agreement in 2013 that preemptively traded a large portion of our leverage even before formal negotiations began. The Iranians came to the table desperate for sanctions relief. They were not there as freedom-loving, good citizens of the world, nor were they aspiring to be. The leverage was sanctions relief, which is proof that the sanctions were working. Non-nuclear activities weren't also on the table, but should have been. Because once you negotiate away all the leverage that'll bring the Iranians to the table in the first place, you don't have the leverage left to deal with all of Iran's other bad activities that you need to deal with. Second, the United States underestimated just how desperate the Iranian leadership was in order to stay in power. There was no reason for the United States to assume the position of weakness that it did in the negotiation. We should have been by far the stronger party in the talks. For some very odd reason, the United States continued to negotiate from a weaker and weaker position for no good or acceptable reason. And next, one line after another was crossed, set by the United States, and when it was crossed, there were no consequences, further weakening our negotiating hand. The United States also very much cared about hitting target dates that the Iranians didn't care whether or not were hit. That too further weakened our negotiating hand. When the president and his administration get rolled by a foreign adversary, we all, as Americans, are getting rolled. It's a huge problem. And what was made worse by paying a $1.7 billion cash ransom to get our hostages released, pallets of unmarked cash had to be airlifted and delivered at the same exact time as releasing our hostages. Now, there are a lot of people who say that it wasn't a ransom. And when you have to pay $1.7 billion on pallets of cash delivered at the exact same moment as releasing the hostages, it's kind of hard to cut it any other way. Paying this cash ransom to the world's largest state-sponsored terror showed the ridiculous lengths the Obama administration was willing to go at any and all costs to appease Iran and show weakness to other American adversaries who are witnessing this all play out. Recent reports reveal that the Obama administration misled the American people and granted a license letting Iran access the United States financial system when U.S. government officials pledged that they would never allow Iran to access U.S. investments or markets. This Iran nuclear deal provided Iran with a jackpot of up to $150 billion in sanctions relief without even asking for a signature. Secretary Kerry called it, quote, an unsigned political commitment. Ben Rhodes, the White House's taxpayer-funded fiction writer, created an echo chamber to promote a false narrative and sell a devil's bargain of a deal to the American people. Even Democratic members of this chamber were feeling the heat from the White House, forced to support what they were privately admitting was an unsigned, unchecked, bad deal. Secretary Kerry admitted that this deal was never intended to receive congressional approval. He said this wasn't a treaty because a treaty would have been, quote, impossible to pass. Now, I don't know how anyone out there would define what a legal definition of treaty is, but I'm pretty confident that that wouldn't be it. The U.S. should have never entered this historically bad deal to begin with, and really could have done a much better job negotiating it. As I mentioned earlier, the Iran nuclear deal was fatally flawed for what was in it, and fatally flawed for what was not put in it. Next, I will discuss some of the reasons why it was fatally flawed for what was in it. The JCPOA isn't a pathway for how to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. It is a blueprint for exactly how Iran attains a nuclear weapon. Two of the biggest issues with what was in it: inside the JCPOA, you have a very flawed verification regime and highly problematic sunset provisions. And President Obama said that this deal wasn't built on trust, it was built on verification. I don't know how you support a deal that's built on verification when you have no idea what the verification regime is. I, as a member of Congress, still have not received the secret side deals between the IAEA and Iran that outlined the verification regime. When Secretary Kerry was before the House Foreign Affairs Committee last Congress, I asked him if he had read it, and he said no. The Secretary of State did not read the verification regime. But the American public was told this is a deal built on trust, not built on trust, built on verification. Now, we have learned since some of what's in those side deals, like Iran collects some of their own soil samples and is the inspector of some of their own nuclear sites. It's crazy, right? The United States made a slew of permanent concessions in exchange for temporary concessions on the part of the Iranians, a point which comes into much greater focus as these sunset provisions are analyzed. The sunset clause undermines any reasonable justification for the deal, providing Iran the capability to attain a nuclear weapon within a few years, even if it didn't cheat on the deal at all. And that, of course, is in addition to the $150 billion of sanctions relief. Under the JCPOA, Iran was still allowed to assemble a limited amount of advanced centrifuges that could enrich uranium for a nuclear weapon within 1 year. However, Iran has even violated those minimal restrictions multiple times. Iran has spun more IR-6 centrifuges than permitted under the JCPOA. It has assembled more IR-8 rotor assemblies than it's permitted to. It has attempted to acquire carbon fiber that it had agreed not to. It has stockpiled more heavy water than what was allowed under the JCPOA. And just think, the people who have said that Iran has not violated the letter of the deal, those are all examples of the letter of the deal being violated. With regards to verification, the Iranians have said before, during, and after this deal that they would allow no access to their military sites whatsoever. We said that we were going to have access to their military sites. The Iranians said the entire time, before, during, and after, you'll never have access to our military sites. And on top of it all, the United States agreed that we wouldn't have any of our weapons inspectors participate in any of the inspections. The IAEA on its own has failed to conduct a thorough review of Iran's nuclear testing capabilities. As just one example, in September 2015, when the Iranian officials then granted limited access to IAEA inspectors at the Parchin facility, although environmental samples revealed chemically man-modified particles of natural uranium, the IAEA did not pursue an explanation or even an inquiry. This Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a house of cards. So what are we doing? Not only was a better deal absolutely obtainable, but no deal would have been better than this agreement. Next, I want to discuss in further detail why the JCPOA was fatally flawed for what was not in it. When Secretary Kerry chose to ignore Iran's bad non-nuclear activities in the region, he negotiated away all of the leverage that brought the Iranians to the table in the first place. You cannot separate Iran's ballistic missile development designed to deliver a nuclear warhead from its nuclear weapons program. Iran has continued to pursue its ICBM development in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Iran has continued to finance terrorists, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and has continued to work to overthrow foreign governments. Iran supports Assad in Syria, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen. They have consolidated massive territorial control, building a land bridge between Tehran and Beirut, a direct threat to the security and stability of regional partners such as Iran and Jordan. By failing to address Iran's non-nuclear activities, the JCPOA has given Iran more resources to pursue its terrorist ambitions in the region. And these are unfortunately just a few of the examples of Iran's bad activities. Since the JCPOA was entered into, Iranian aggression in the Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, it's only increased. Iran has launched as many as 23 ballistic missiles since the conclusion of the July 2015 nuclear deal. They have illegally financed terrorist activities wreaking havoc in the Middle East. Iran has recommitted to wiping Israel off of the map. They call them the little Satan. They chant death to America in their streets. They call the United States the great Satan. In their parliament, in their streets, on their holidays, all while unjustly imprisoning American citizens. In the past 2 years, Iran has blown up mock U.S. warships, seized one of our Navy vessels, and subsequently held hostage and publicly embarrassed 10 American sailors. Do you remember Secretary Kerry's reaction to Iran holding hostage and embarrassing those sailors? His response was thank you. He was thanking the Iranians. He defended the whole situation as evidence of an improved relationship with Iran. That's living in an alternate version of reality. One fundamental question is often misunderstood, and in many cases it's not even asked. What leverage could we have moving forward to tackle all of Iran's threatening actions if we eliminate the sanctions that bring the Iranians to the table in the first place? And President Trump is absolutely correct to reimpose the toughest sanctions against Iran's oil and financial sector and IRGC officials, agents, and affiliates. In order to regain the leverage that brought the Iranians to the table, we must increase financial pressure so that Iran does not have the ability to back terrorist groups across the world and keep their economy afloat. With Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton working so closely with our president to counter Iran's aggression, I feel confident when they say, quote, no path to a nuclear weapon, not now, not ever. The onus is on Iran. If they like the sanctions relief, they want to keep the sanctions relief, then the United States has just a few reasonable requirements. The verification regime needs to be fixed. The sunset provisions need to be lifted, and the other bad, nefarious, illegal activities must end. If there are any other nations around the world that want to keep the sanctions relief in place, then convince Iran to change its behavior and agree to the United States' very reasonable demands. It's very telling that so many nations in the Middle East are supportive of President Trump's determination to push back against Iranian aggression. They are the ones who are most impacted, and they support the decision. In 2009, millions of Iranians poured into the streets to protest a fraudulent election of then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The United States and rest of the world then offered zero support following that undemocratic election. President Obama said it was all none of our business, which proved to not only be wrong, but also a huge error in judgment. We must learn from our lesson of 2009 and not repeat that same mistake. The United States must support the millions of Iranians who continue to march in the streets, desperate for support to help them turn the tide in Tehran and all throughout Iran. There are millions of people in Iran who want a free, stable, democratic Iran. Now in 2018, Iranians have once again courageously poured into the streets to protest the brutality of President Hassan Rouhani's regime. Just this week, we are witnessing the largest protest in Tehran since 2012, over the course of the last few months, I should say. Keep in mind that whenever we hear about how the most moderate candidates get elected in Iran, this is a point I've heard a lot, that Iran elects the most moderate candidates. But so often, they leave out the important point that the 12,000 most moderate candidates are denied access to the ballot altogether. The only choice has been to pick a pro-regime hardliner, and we should be under no illusions otherwise. By withdrawing from the JCPOA, President Trump is sending an important message to the Iranians that America will not accept a regime that tortures its own people, funds terrorist activities, and vows for the destruction of the United States and our great ally Israel. The United States is a nation that is not even close to equals with Iran. We are the greatest nation in the world. And when we engage in these negotiations, we must do so from a position of strength and not relinquish that. That is all that this adversary respects. We can't be silent, not because we want war, but because we want to prevent it. The good news is now in July of 2018, again, we are treating Israel like Israel and Iran like Iran. One of my complaints, many other Americans, is that for a while we were treating Israel like Iran and Iran like Israel. It made no sense. As I mentioned earlier in this hour, how important it is for the United States to be strong, consistent, and effective in our foreign policy, to strengthen our relationships with our friends, to treat our adversaries as our adversaries, understanding that our enemies, our adversaries, do not respect weakness, they only respect strength. I wish that this entire negotiation had gone down very differently in the first place, but fast forward to today with President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Bolton, their team, with other countries aligned with us, especially in the Middle East, we can pursue a better path forward. And for all of those who are interested, whether you like the JCPOA or not, if you like the sanctions relief or not, but hopefully all concerned with Iran's bad activities, especially their nuclear and their non-nuclear activities as well, you can help us, putting the onus on Iran and encouraging them to accept our very reasonable demands.